in a certain way. If their neighbor is given a day off for sciatica, they themselves may claim to have sciatica. If their neighbor is given a break because of their allergies, the excuse of allergies is written in the playbook to be used at some point in time in the future. In the long run, this may cost them fish. There's a great many jobs, a great many positions which involve an element of trust. And if you're a person who cannot be trusted, your options may be limited. For whatever reason, there are some who will have less, and for whatever reason, there are some who will have more. If we were living out in the forest with one other person, in the story we have two hermits sharing a cabin, we would have a greater sense of why one person consistently brings back more fish while the other consistently brings back less. When you're dealing with more people, it becomes increasingly difficult to say why some have less and why some have more. For one thing, every case is different. The baker whose yeast was infected with a rare mold stands alongside a stranger we don't know. They could be a jailbird. They could be a candlestick maker who sold no candles. When you're dealing with thousands of people, we don't know specifically why things are the way they are, but we have a sense of why things are the way they are. We have theories about how these complicated undercurrents work. Like currents in the ocean, it's difficult to know how they come about, and they're sometimes difficult to see. There are people who believe these currents move money and resources around in a way that can harm society. Money collects in certain places for reasons that are unexpected, counterintuitive, and unfair. It's sometimes obvious to see that money and resources run thin in other places. And I cannot emphasize enough that it's sometimes obvious to see, but not all the time. There are times in which a geographical area can have very little money and very few resources, but you never know it. In every society, resources are pooled for common projects. There are those who believe some money and resources should be collected and redistributed in a calculated way to help the baker clean and sanitize the kitchen without raising the price of bread, to subsidize the candle maker to get them through the summer months until the winter months, when people need candles again. If we look at things in terms of fish, each person should have a daily fish. When this happens, people lose even more of their sense of having earned their way. Fish are not earned, fish are issued. When people have hardships and they're issued fish because of their hardships, there's a feeling similar to earning. A person feels that because of their hardships, they got a fish. Now, let's begin to give shape to our characters. Let's look at Gary. Gary's trappings and how he collects these trappings is fairly straightforward. When it comes to the rental house, Gary straddles two boats. The first boat represents what he has at a specific point in time. If we were to go to the moment when the inheritance was read and he discovered he owned 1/3 of a house, we could look at that as simply an asset. In some respect, he was given fish that others may not have. That asset fell into his lap. The other boat has a timeline which stretches forward and back. 30 years before that time, his uncle had plans for the future, which eventually put 1/3 of the house in Gary's lap. And it's the circumstance of that second boat which leads him to buy out his siblings and fix up the place. The act of buying out his siblings and fixing up the place wouldn't have taken place in the first boat. The first boat doesn't involve plans for the future. Within the context of the first boat, buying out your siblings and fixing up the place is nonsense. You're simply losing assets. In that first boat, you don't take into account what's going to happen in the future. The money he's losing is seen as an investment. With any investment, there's a certain amount of risk. There was a risk in renting it out. It was a risk, by the way, that didn't pan out. The rental was destroyed, and he lost money in a lawsuit over an eviction. When Gary describes his circumstance, we discover both of these boats are important. There's a question of what he actually has at any point in time. There's the other question of what will happen with that which I have earned. If his uncle knew all his assets would be liquidated and absorbed by the powers that be upon his death, he may not work as hard keeping his house looking nice. If Gary thought that at any time the house would be absorbed by the powers that be, he may not work hard to fix it up. There's a certain energy which magically keeps it looking nice over the years. We see what can happen when that energy is gone, when Gary rents it out and the place is destroyed. The place is inhabited by people who have no energy to keep it nice. In fact, they're motivated to destroy it. At the very end of the book, when Ron and Sammy are waiting for the light to change to cross the street, Ron points out a car that looks like the rental car Ron and Gary used to drive cross-country, and Ron says he hopes whoever is driving it is taking care of it. And Sammy asks, why? It has to do with the energy and motivation involved in maintenance, growth, or decay. With a rental car, how hard are you going to work to maintain it? Are you going to have the oil changed? No. Are you going to put money into it? Are you going to take it to the stereo shop to have a new stereo put in? No. Well, why not? You want it to look nice, don't you? The answer has to do with that second boat that Gary has his foot in. One more thing I'll say about Gary is that he seems like he's found himself in the predicament of holding more fish than others. Even Gary might assume that he has more in this world than the renters who trashed his place. That may or may not be true. Gary spent quite a lot of money buying his cousins out. He spent quite a lot of time and energy fixing up the place. When it was destroyed, he was out a lot of money. Let's throw around some numbers here. I'll put this in the terms of the tutorial. Gary's uncle's house was worth 300 fish. Gary spent 200 fish buying out his siblings. So he's out 200 fish. He spent the equivalent of 100 fish fixing it up. That includes time and materials. So he's out 300 fish. He recouped very little from the rental, and any profit that he did collect was lost in the lawsuit. So he's out 300 fish. The renters skipped rent, so they were able to save a few fish. Gary's down 300 fish, and the renters are at zero. But still, the impression felt by both Gary and the renters is that Gary is ahead of the game. And, just by virtue of who he is, I would have to agree that he is ahead of the game. But realize, the numbers don't reflect that. The perception of who's doing better and who's doing worse is very important. As we built our little make-believe society, we came to the part about the hermit who shares his fish with the other hermit who had none. As our society grew, there are times when resources were used on a larger scale so that no villager went without fish. In the story of Rental Car, Gary worked hard and put forth a hearty investment in the rental. His tenants came along and trashed the place. Gary feels like the scales of justice are weighted in their favor because he comes to the table looking like he has more fish.